The courtroom pulsed with hushed whispers, a low hum of tension filling the air. Every seat was packed, strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked onto the defendant's table. The name James Carter had consumed headlines for weeks, an echo of scandal, betrayal, and ruin. And now, here he was. He strode in like he owned the place, broad-shouldered and towering, wrapped in a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. His slicked-back hair gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, and that smirk, cocky, unbothered, sat firmly on his face. It wasn't the expression of a man burdened by guilt. It was the smirk of someone who believed he was untouchable. To the crowd, it felt like a slap in the face. James Carter wasn't just wealthy. He was the kind of rich that made rules bend and justice feel optional. He had everything: yachts anchored in private marinas, mansions sprawled across both coasts, jets waiting on standby to take him anywhere in the world. His company, Carter Investments, had once been a beacon of success, a name people trusted with their futures. But beneath the polished promises and glitzy advertisements lay deception. He preyed on dreams, weaving golden illusions of prosperity, convincing hard-working families to invest everything they had. Retirement funds, college savings, inheritances. He took it all, smiling as he did. And when the truth finally surfaced, it was too late. The money had vanished, swallowed into a void no one could trace. Families lost their homes. Parents sat their children down, voices shaking, and said, "We can't afford it anymore." For some, the devastation wasn't just financial. It was the crushing weight of lost hope, the kind of betrayal that made the world feel cruel and merciless. Then, the heavy wooden doors swung open, and the room fell still. Judge Eleanor Kim stepped inside, her presence commanding silence without a single word. She was known for her fairness, her unwavering authority, and her relentless pursuit of justice. When she took the bench, there was no favoritism, no loopholes, only truth. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Kim," the bailiff announced. As one, the courtroom stood, a unified wall of quiet respect. Everyone except James Carter. He remained seated, casually flipping through a notepad, as if this were just another boardroom meeting. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but James waved him off without so much as a glance. Judge Kim paused, her sharp eyes locking onto him. She said nothing, not yet. But the silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, and in that moment, for the first time, the room belonged to her. Not to James Carter, not anymore. Unbearable. Judge Eleanor Kim's voice cut through the charged silence like a blade, steady, firm, and unshaken. "You may be seated," she commanded. The rustling of fabric and the creak of wooden benches filled the air as the courtroom settled, but the weight of what was to come pressed heavy on everyone's shoulders. The trial had begun, and with it, the full scale of James Carter's crimes unraveled, piece by agonizing piece. Angela Parker, a single mother of 3, sat in the front row. Her fingers gripped the edges of her coat as if bracing herself for impact. She had lost her home because of him. Beside her sat Tom Hayes, a retired firefighter, a man who had spent his life charging into burning buildings to save others, only to have his own future reduced to ashes by Carter Investments. Every testimony was another wound laid bare. Angela's voice trembled as she recounted the day she realized she couldn't make her mortgage payment. "I begged them not to take my house," she whispered, her breath hitching as tears streamed down her face. "I pleaded with them, told them I just needed time, but they didn't care. My kids and I slept in our car for 2 weeks. 2 weeks." Her hands shook as she wiped at her tears. "Do you know what it's like to tell your children they can't go home?" A ripple of quiet grief spread through the courtroom. Then came Tom. He sat upright, shoulders stiff, his weathered hands clenched into fists. "I spent decades running into burning buildings," he said, his voice raw with fury. "And this man, this smug bastard, burned my future to the ground without so much as a second thought." Through it all, James Carter barely looked up. He lounged in his chair, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone, whispering occasional remarks to his lawyer, completely unmoved. The anguish of the people he had destroyed meant nothing to him. The prosecution didn't hold back. They laid out damning emails, documents that exposed the heart of Carter's deception. One message, displayed in bold letters across the screen, sent an audible gasp through the room. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign." A heavy silence settled. Angela shook her head, her expression a mixture of heartbreak and rage. Tom gritted his teeth, his knuckles white as he balled his fists. "And James?" He smirked. The prosecutor turned to him. "Mr. Carter, do you confirm this email as one you personally sent?" James leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Oh, I recognize it," he said smoothly. "But let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." A sharp intake of breath spread through the gallery. Disgust, outrage. Even the most restrained members of the court could barely contain their contempt. Judge Kim's gavel slammed against the bench like a thunderclap. "Order in the court!" Her gaze fixed on James, piercing and unyielding. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice like ice, "I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom." But James wasn't intimidated. He rolled his eyes, chuckled under his breath, and continued whispering smug jokes to his lawyer, as if the entire trial was nothing more than an inconvenience. Then, the turning point. Angela took the witness stand, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "I trusted you," her voice cracked. "I trusted you with everything I had." She swallowed hard. "And you destroyed my family." But James didn't even glance up. His eyes stayed locked on his phone, his thumb lazily scrolling as though her words were background noise, nothing more than a distraction. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice cut through the tension, sharp and furious. "The defendant is not even paying attention." Judge Kim's expression remained composed, but her eyes burned with a quiet, simmering fury. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low and cold, "put your phone away, now." James finally looked up, lazily lifting the device as if to justify himself. "I'm checking something important," he replied, his tone dismissive, as if she were interrupting him. The room held its breath. Judge Kim's lips pressed into a thin line. "I said, now." For a brief moment, it looked as if James might challenge her. His arrogance had carried him this far. Why stop now? But something in her gaze made him hesitate. With a dramatic sigh, he set the phone down, dragging the moment out like a bored child being scolded. The silence that followed was heavy, and for the first time the power in the room shifted. It no longer belonged to James Carter. It never would again. James Carter sank back in his chair, an exasperated sigh slipping from his lips, as if putting his phone away had been a personal favor to Judge Kim. Angela Parker shook her head, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I don't understand," she whispered, her eyes locked onto him. "I don't understand how someone can be so heartless. How you can just sit there, smug and indifferent, acting like none of this matters." But James didn't flinch. His face remained blank, his arrogance unshaken. By the time the trial neared its end, the evidence against him had grown into an unscalable wall, undeniable, damning, inescapable. His lawyer tried in vain to frame him as a misunderstood businessman, a victim of circumstance, but the truth stood in the open, unyielding. The verdict came swiftly, guilty, on all counts. The day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed to the brim. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashing like lightning in a storm. Victims clung to one another, hands squeezed so tightly their knuckles turned white. And James? He sat at the defense table, that insufferable smirk still etched onto his face, as if this was all a game he was still convinced he could win. Judge Kim's voice rang through the courtroom, steady and unshaken. "Mr. Carter, you have been found guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, but what stands out even more is your utter lack of remorse. No accountability. No respect for this court. No regard for the lives you've destroyed. For the first time, James's smirk twitched. Judge Kim's eyes remained locked on him, unwavering. I sentence you to... She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle over him. Years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. A collective gasp rippled through the room. James shot to his feet, his face flushed with fury. You can't do this, he bellowed, his voice cracking under the strain of his rage. I'm James Carter. You can't treat me like this. The gavel slammed down, sharp and unforgiving. This is my courtroom, Mr. Carter. Sit down. James hesitated, chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, before two officers flanked him, gripping his arms. His struggles were useless. Judge Kim wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, her tone cold and final, I am ordering the liquidation of your assets. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the people you wronged. James's jaw clenched. He fought against the officer's grip, his voice seething. No, you can't. But he could do nothing. As he was dragged from the courtroom, the room erupted. Applause and relieved sobs filled the space where, for too long, fear and despair had resided. Angela Parker pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed, her shoulders shaking as tears streamed down her cheeks. Tom Hayes let out a long, uneven breath, his eyes glistening as he turned to embrace the people beside him. Outside the courthouse, microphones were thrust toward Angela, cameras blinking red as reporters clamored for a statement. She lifted her chin, voice steady despite the weight in her heart. No sentence will undo what he did, she said softly. No ruling will give us back what we lost. But at least now, we have hope. And for Judge Kim, there was no celebration, no personal triumph in the sentence she had delivered. Justice wasn't about punishment. It was about restoring what could be restored. It was about making sure men like James Carter never did this again. It was about finally closing the door on his power forever.